She was just a woman sitting under a palm tree. But she was about to lead an entire nation to war, and victory. In a world where men commanded armies and women stayed silent, one voice rose above the chaos. Her name was Deborah. And what she did next would shock an empire and change history forever. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and comment below. What's the boldest decision you've ever made? Your story might inspire someone else. The morning sun filtered through the leaves of the palm tree, casting dappled shadows across Deborah's face as she sat in her usual spot. This was where she held court, not in a grand palace or behind city walls, but under this tree between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. They called it Deborah's Palm. It wasn't just a meeting place. It was a symbol of hope in a land drowning in despair. People came from villages near and far, trudging up dusty paths with their burdens and disputes. Some carried physical loads, grain sacks, traded goods, injured livestock. Others carried heavier, invisible burdens, broken promises, stolen inheritance, desperate pleas for justice. All of them came to her. Not to the priests. Not to the elders. Not to the warriors. To Deborah. A woman. In those days, this was unheard of. Women didn't lead. Women didn't judge. Women didn't speak for God. Except Deborah did. The Lord says your brother must return your father's fields, she told one man, her voice gentle but firm. The boundary stones were moved in secret, but God sees what is done in darkness. The man's eyes widened. No one knew about the boundary stones except him and his brother. Yet somehow, Deborah knew. Because God had told her. That's what made Deborah different. She wasn't just wise. She wasn't just fair. She was a prophetess. Someone who heard directly from God and spoke his words with unflinching courage. As the last petitioner left that afternoon, Deborah remained seated, her fingers tracing patterns in the dirt beside her. Something was stirring in her spirit. A heaviness. A knowing. God was about to speak again. And this time, it wasn't about boundary stones or inheritance disputes. It was about war. Israel was broken. For 20 years, the people had lived under the cruel boot of Jabin, king of Canaan. His military commander, Cicera, patrolled the land with 900 iron chariots, weapons of terror that no Israelite force could match. These weren't ordinary chariots. They were built for maximum destruction, with sharp iron blades extending from the wheel hubs, designed to cut down anyone in their path. The ground trembled when they approached. The sound of their wheels striking stone sent children running for their mothers' arms. Israelite men had been systematically disarmed. Their blacksmiths were forbidden to forge weapons. Their warriors were scattered or killed. Their spirits were crushed under constant oppression. Why had God allowed this? The answer was simple and painful: Israel had turned away from him. Again. After the death of Ehud, their previous judge, the people had drifted back to worshipping the gods of Canaan, Baal and Asherah. They bowed before wooden poles and stone altars. They participated in rituals that dishonored the God who had delivered them from Egypt. So God had withdrawn his protection, allowing Jabin and Cicera to subjugate them. Now, the roads lay abandoned. Travelers took hidden paths through the hills to avoid Canaanite patrols. Villages were routinely raided for food, valuables, and even people. Young women disappeared into Sisera's camps. Young men were forced into labor. Elders who resisted were executed publicly as warnings. Fear hung over the land like a storm cloud that wouldn't break. But after 20 years of suffering, something was changing. The people were remembering. They were crying out. Not to Baal. Not to Asherah. To Yahweh. The God of their fathers. And God had chosen to answer through Deborah. Barak was tending his few remaining sheep when the messenger arrived. "The prophetess Deborah summons you to her palm tree," the young boy said, slightly out of breath from his journey. Barak frowned. He had never met Deborah, though everyone knew of her. What could the judge of Israel want with him? The next morning, he stood before her, a tall man with weathered skin and cautious eyes. Once, he had been a leader in Naphtali, respected for his skill with a sword and his tactical mind. But that was before Cicera's reign of terror. Now, like most Israelite men, he kept his head down and focused on survival. Deborah studied him carefully before speaking. "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. Go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lead Cicera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands." Barak stared at her, shock evident on his face. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, harsh sound with no joy in it. "You want me to gather an army? Against Cicera?" He shook his head. "Where would I find 10,000 men willing to die? And with what weapons would they fight? Cicera has 900 iron chariots. We have farming tools and shepherd staffs." "God doesn't see what you see," Deborah replied calmly. "He sees victory where you see defeat." Barak's jaw tightened. "If I were to do this, and I'm not saying I will, I would need proof that God is truly in it." "What proof do you require?" He pointed directly at her. "You. If you go with me, I'll go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." It was a challenge. Perhaps even a dismissal. Surely a woman who merely sat and judged disputes wouldn't risk her life on a battlefield. Surely this talk of war was just that, talk. But Deborah didn't hesitate. "Very well," she said, rising to her feet. "I will go with you. But because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Cicera into the hands of a woman." Something in her tone made Barak's skin prickle. There was no fear in her eyes. No doubt. Only unwavering certainty. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him. Not quite hope, he'd forgotten how to hope. But something close to it. A tiny spark in a heart long cold. "I'll gather the men," he said quietly. And so began the most unlikely military campaign in Israel's history, led by a prophetess and a reluctant general against the most fearsome army in Canaan. Word spread through whispers and hushed conversations. A call to arms. Not shouted in village squares where Canaanite spies might hear, but passed from one trusted friend to another. "The prophetess has heard from God. Barak of Naphtali is gathering fighters at Kadesh. It's time." Not everyone answered the call. Some tribes remained in their territories, unwilling to risk Sisera's wrath. The people of Reuben debated long among their sheep pens but ultimately stayed behind. Gilead remained east of the Jordan. Dan and Asher clung to their coastal regions. But from Naphtali and Zebulun they came, farmers, shepherds, craftsmen. Men who had never held a proper sword. Men who had hidden their families in caves during Canaanite raids. Men who bore scars, both visible and hidden, from 20 years of oppression. They gathered at Kadesh, a scrappy collection of determined but terrified Israelites. Many wondered if they had made a terrible mistake as soon as they arrived. There were no proper weapons, no armor, no war horses. Just ordinary men with sharpened farm tools, slings, and a few precious swords hidden away during previous raids. Deborah arrived with Barak, her straight-backed confidence a stark contrast to the fear etched on most faces. She wore no special garments, carried no symbols of authority except a simple staff. Yet when she moved through the gathered men, they parted before her, sensing something different about this woman. Barak looked over the gathering with a military commander's eye and saw precisely what he feared, an inadequate force with poor equipment and little training. His heart sank. But then Deborah began to speak. "Men of Israel," her voice carried across the assembly with surprising strength. "For 20 years you have hidden your faces. For 20 years you have watched your daughters taken, your sons enslaved, your elders humiliated. For 20 years you have cried out, 'Where is our God?'" She paused, her gaze sweeping over them. "He is here. Now. Not in spite of your weakness, but because of it. The Lord does not need iron chariots. He does not need trained armies. He needs willing hearts." She pointed toward Mount Tabor in the distance, its imposing form rising from the Jezreel valley. "We will go there. And God will deliver Cicera into our hands." A murmur ran through the crowd, part doubt, part desperate hope. "But how?" someone called out. "His chariots will cut us down before we even reach them." Deborah smiled, and in that smile was a secret knowledge that sent shivers through the assembly. "The Lord will fight for you," she said simply. "You need only be still and watch what he will do." As the makeshift army prepared to march toward Mount Tabor, messengers arrived from unexpected quarters. Fighters from Ephraim, Benjamin, Machir, and Issachar were coming to join them. Word of Deborah's prophecy had spread farther than anyone anticipated. By the time they reached the slopes of Mount Tabor, 10,000 men stood with Barak and Deborah, still outnumbered, still outmatched in terms of weaponry and training, but united by a fragile, newborn hope. Hope sparked by a woman who refused to fear. Mount Tabor was an inspired choice for a military position. Rising about 1,400 feet above the surrounding valleys, it offered clear views in every direction. No army could approach without being seen miles away. Its steep slopes made it difficult to attack, particularly for chariots that required flat ground to maneuver effectively. But it was also a trap. Once on the mountain, there was no easy escape. Barak realized this as he organized the men into fighting units. "If Cicera surrounds the mountain, we're finished," he told Deborah as they stood gazing down at the plains below. "We have food and water for perhaps 2 weeks. After that, we won't be here," Deborah replied with that maddening certainty that both reassured and unnerved him. "Cicera will come exactly where and when God has determined." Barak shook his head. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I have heard it from God himself." She looked at him directly. "Do you truly believe I would lead these men, these fathers, sons, brothers, to their deaths on a whim or a guess?" Before Barak could respond, a shout went up from one of the sentries. Dust clouds were visible on the horizon, the unmistakable sign of a large force on the move. Word of the Israelite gathering had reached Cicera more quickly than they'd anticipated. The Canaanite commander had mobilized immediately, bringing not just his 900 chariots but thousands of foot soldiers as well. From their vantage point on Mount Tabor, the Israelites watched as Sisera's massive army poured into the valley below, setting up camp near the Kishon River. The iron chariots gleamed in the sunlight, an awesome and terrifying sight. Many of the Israelite men had never seen so many chariots gathered in one place. Fear rippled through their ranks. "We're outnumbered at least 3 to 1, one of Barak's lieutenants whispered. "And those chariots?" Barak himself felt his courage wavering as he watched Sisera's professional army arrange itself with military precision. These were trained killers with the best weapons Canaan could produce, led by a commander who had never lost a battle. What had he been thinking, agreeing to this madness? He turned to Deborah, expecting to see at least some concern on her face. Instead, she was looking not at Sisera's army, but at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering to the west, unusual for that time of year. "It's time," she said. "Time for what?" Barak asked. "Time to go down the mountain." She turned to him, her eyes alight with something that looked almost like excitement. "The Lord has gone out before you." Barak stared at her in disbelief. Go down. Into their chariots. That's suicide. Today the Lord will deliver Cicera into your hands, Deborah insisted. Now go. Isn't the Lord going ahead of you? It was madness. Every military instinct in Barak's body screamed against it. To lead 10,000 poorly equipped men down a mountain into the face of 900 iron chariots on open ground? But there was something in Deborah's voice, a divine authority that penetrated his fear. And despite himself, despite every rational thought, Barak found himself giving the order. Prepared to move out, he called to his lieutenants. We attack within the hour. As the Israelite army scrambled to ready themselves, the western sky grew darker. The clouds Deborah had been watching were now a threatening mass, heavy with rain. What no one yet realized was that God was about to turn Cicera's greatest advantage into his greatest vulnerability. Thunder rolled across the sky as Barak led his men down the slopes of Mount Tabor. The sound seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. Behind him, 10,000 Israelites moved in a flood of determined humanity, their improvised weapons clutched in white-knuckled grips. Below them, Cicera's army had spotted their approach. Horns blared as the Canaanites rushed to form battle lines. Chariot drivers prepared their fearsome vehicles, checking harnesses and readying their weapons. Cicera himself watched from a raised platform, a slight smile playing on his lips. The Israelites were doing exactly what he'd hoped, abandoning their defensive position to face him on open ground where his chariots would slaughter them. It would be over quickly. A fool's errand, he remarked to his lieutenant. But it saves us the trouble of a siege. Then the heavens opened. Not with a gentle shower, but with a torrential downpour that seemed targeted at the battlefield. Water fell in sheets, turning the dusty plain into a quagmire within minutes. Lightning cracked overhead, followed immediately by deafening thunder. The sudden storm was so violent, so unexpected, that it momentarily paralyzed both armies. But Deborah had been expecting it. As the first fat raindrops hit her upturned face, she called out to Barak over the growing din, "This is God's hand. Now attack." Barak raised his sword, and with a mighty shout that was echoed by 10,000 voices, the Israelites charged toward the Canaanite lines. Meanwhile, Sisera's prized chariots, the terror of Canaan, were rapidly becoming useless. The ground beneath them, already soft from the first spring rains, turned to mud under the deluge. Chariot wheels designed to roll swiftly over packed earth now sank axle-deep. Horses panicked, rearing and straining against their harnesses as lightning flashed overhead and thunder shook the valley. The Kishon River, normally a modest stream at that time of year, began to swell with runoff from the higher ground. Water rushed down from the surrounding hills, turning the river into a torrent that burst its banks, flooding the lower portions of the battlefield. The stars fought from heaven, Deborah would later sing. The Kishon River swept them away, that ancient river, the Kishon. What had been Sisera's greatest advantage? The flat valley perfect for chariot warfare, became a death trap. Canaanite soldiers fought not only the attacking Israelites but also the elements themselves as mud sucked at their sandals and floodwaters rose around them. Barak and his men, meanwhile, attacked with the fury of people who had endured 20 years of oppression. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Many had personal scores to settle, a daughter taken, a brother killed, a home destroyed. They fought not as trained soldiers but as men possessed, empowered by a righteous anger long suppressed. And they had one critical advantage: they were mostly on foot, able to navigate the increasingly treacherous terrain far better than the chariot-dependent Canaanites. The battle quickly turned into a rout. Canaanite soldiers, realizing their position was untenable, began to flee. But there was nowhere to go. The flooded Kishon blocked retreat in one direction, the attacking Israelites blocked the other. Cicera, seeing his mighty army disintegrating before his eyes, abandoned his command post. Leaving his chariot behind, he fled on foot, something unthinkable for a commander of his stature. his only thought now was survival. Barak led his men in pursuit of the fleeing Canaanites, cutting them down as they ran. Not one of Sisera's men survived the day. But Cicera himself had disappeared into the chaos of the storm. Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite, was preparing wool for spinning when she noticed the man stumbling toward her tent. The Kenite were descendants of Moses' father-in-law and had maintained a carefully neutral position in the conflicts between Israel and Canaan. They were metalworkers by trade, providing services to whomever paid. Heber had established a peace treaty with King Jabin of Canaan, which allowed his family to live undisturbed near Kadesh. Their neutrality had served them well. Until now. The man approaching was clearly a soldier, though he wore no armor and carried no weapon. His clothing was expensive but muddied and torn. He moved with the desperation of hunted prey. As he drew closer, Jael recognized him with a jolt of surprise. Cicera, the commander of Jabin's army, the terror of Israel. And he was coming to her tent. Please, he called out when he spotted her. I need help. Jael stepped outside her tent. As a Kenite woman, she was in an unusual position. Unlike many women in that region, Kenite women owned their own tents and had significant authority within their family structures. This was Jael's tent, not her husband's. Turn aside, my lord, she called back, making a quick decision. Turn aside to me, don't be afraid. Cicera approached, his eyes darting constantly behind him. Water, he gasped. I need water. Jael led him inside her tent. Instead of water, she opened a skin of milk, rich, warm, and calming, and gave it to him. He drank deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. Stand in the doorway of the tent, he instructed her when he had finished. If anyone comes by and asks you, is anyone in there, say, no. Jael nodded obediently. Rest here, she said, indicating a comfortable spot with cushions. You're safe now. Exhausted from battle and flight, lulled by the warm milk and false security, Cicera lay down. Within moments, he was in a deep sleep. Jael stood watching him, her mind racing. This man was responsible for decades of terror. His armies had raided villages, killed innocents, taken women captive. While the Kenite had been spared due to their treaty, Jael had seen the suffering of her Israelite neighbors. Moreover, she had heard the rumors spreading throughout the region that morning, that the prophetess Deborah had led an Israelite uprising, that God had intervened with a mighty storm, that Sisera's undefeated army had been utterly destroyed. If those rumors were true, then the man sleeping in her tent represented the old order, an order that God himself had apparently decided to overthrow. And here he was, delivered into her hands. Moving silently, Jael took a tent peg from her supplies. Kenite women were responsible for setting up and taking down their own tents. She was no stranger to the hammer and peg. She selected the longest, strongest peg she could find and picked up her mallet. She approached Cicera's sleeping form, her footsteps muffled by the rugs covering the tent floor. He did not stir, exhaustion and the milk having done their work well. Kneeling beside him, Jael positioned the tent peg at his temple. She took a deep breath, raised the mallet, and brought it down with all her strength. The peg drove through his temple and into the ground below. Sisera's body jerked once, then lay still. Jael stood over him, the mallet still gripped in her hand, her heart pounding in her chest. She had just killed the most feared military commander in Canaan. A man who had been a guest in her tent. A man to whom her husband's family had pledged peace. But also a man whose defeat God had ordained. She didn't have long to consider the implications of her action. Soon after, she heard the sound of approaching men, many men, and voices calling Sisera's name. Stepping outside her tent, she saw Barak leading a contingent of Israelite fighters, clearly tracking Sisera's flight path. Come, she called to Barak, and I will show you the man you're looking for. Barak followed her into the tent and stopped short at the sight that greeted him. The mighty Cicera, terror of Israel for 20 years, lay dead with a tent peg through his head, killed not by a warrior but by a woman. In that moment, Barak remembered Deborah's prophecy, "The honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Cicera into the hands of a woman." He had assumed she meant herself. But God had chosen a different woman, a Canaanite, not even an Israelite, to deliver the final blow that would end Israel's oppression. News of Sisera's defeat and death spread quickly throughout Israel. Villages that had lived in fear for 20 years erupted in celebration. People who had hidden in mountain caves returned to their homes. Roads that had been abandoned became traveled again. Most importantly, the people recognized that this victory had not come through human strength or strategy. God had fought for them. He had sent the storm that neutralized Sisera's chariots. He had given courage to a makeshift army of farmers and shepherds. He had guided Cicera to Jael's tent. And he had spoken through a woman who sat beneath a palm tree. On the day set aside for national celebration, Deborah and Barak stood before the gathered tribes and sang a song that would be remembered for generations, a song of praise, of remembrance, and of warning. When the princes in Israel take the lead, Deborah sang, her voice carrying across the assembly, when the people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord. The song recounted the desperate conditions before the battle. Village life in Israel ceased until I, Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. It praised the tribes who had answered the call. My heart is with Israel's princes, with the willing volunteers among the people. Praise the Lord. It chided those who had stayed behind. Why did you stay among the sheep pens to hear the whistling for the flocks? It described God's intervention through the storm. From the heavens the stars fought, from their courses they fought against Cicera. The river Kishon swept them away, the age-old river, the river Kishon. And it celebrated Jael's decisive action, most blessed of women be Jael. Her hand reached for the tent peg, her right hand for the workman's hammer. The song ended with a prayer that all of God's enemies would perish as Cicera had, and that those who love God would be like the sun when it rises in its strength. As the last notes of the song faded, a hush fell over the gathering. Something profound had shifted in Israel's collective spirit. A nation that had been cowering in fear for 20 years now stood tall, reminded of who their God was and what he could do through willing vessels, even the most unexpected ones. The aftermath of Sisera's defeat transformed Israel. Without their military commander and his elite forces, King Jabin's power crumbled. The Israelites pressed their advantage, eventually destroying Jabin completely. But the greater transformation was spiritual. The people returned wholeheartedly to the worship of Yahweh, removing the Baal idols and Asherah poles from their midst. They remembered the covenant their ancestors had made at Mount Sinai and renewed their commitment to follow God's laws. Deborah continued to judge Israel from her palm tree, but her influence now extended far beyond settling local disputes. She had become a mother to the nation, a symbol of God's care and provision during their darkest hour. Barak's life also changed dramatically. Once a bitter, disillusioned man hiding among his sheep, he was now recognized as a military leader blessed by God. But he never forgot that the victory had not been his. He remained close to Deborah, often seeking her counsel, always acknowledging that his courage had come through her faith. As for Jael, her name became legendary. Women sang songs about her bold action. Men spoke of her with respect bordering on awe. The peace treaty between the Canaanite and Canaan was obviously void, but with Jabin's power broken, a new and stronger alliance formed between the Canaanite and Israel. For 40 years, an entire generation, the land had peace. Children grew up hearing the story of how God used a prophetess, a reluctant general, and a woman with a tent peg to deliver Israel. They learned that God could work through anyone willing to be used, regardless of gender, status, or training. They learned that battles are won not by chariots and horses, but by the name of the Lord. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that when God's people return to him with their whole hearts, he responds with deliverance beyond anything they could ask or imagine. Deborah's story stands as one of the most remarkable in the Bible, a woman who led when men faltered, who believed when others doubted, who saw God's hand moving when everyone else saw only overwhelming odds. She broke every cultural barrier of her time. In an age when women were largely invisible in public life, she sat openly, dispensing justice for all Israel. In a society where military leadership was exclusively male, she led an army to victory. In a time when prophets were typically men, she spoke the very words of God with authority and accuracy. But Deborah never sought power for its own sake. She never demanded recognition or special treatment. She simply answered when God called, stood firm when others retreated, and gave all glory to the one who had chosen her. Her legacy teaches us timeless truths, that God often chooses the overlooked to accomplish his purposes. That true courage isn't the absence of fear, but faith in action despite fear. That leadership isn't about titles or positions, but about influencing others to follow God wholeheartedly. That God sees no gender, age, or status when he calls someone to serve, only a willing heart. And perhaps most powerfully, that one person who fully trusts God can change the course of history. Deborah didn't wait for permission to lead. She didn't make excuses about her gender or lack of military experience. She simply obeyed, stepping into the gap when no one else would. What's God asking you to do boldly today? What impossible situation in your life needs divine intervention? What mountain seems too high, what enemy too strong? Remember Deborah. Remember how God used an ordinary woman to bring extraordinary deliverance. And remember her song, a song that began with human weakness but ended with divine strength. A song that echoes through the centuries to remind us that when God fights for us, no force on earth can stand against us. Like Deborah, you too can arise. You too can be the one who stands when others fall. You too can be the voice that speaks God's truth in a time of confusion and fear. The God of Deborah is still looking for willing hearts. Will yours be one of them? If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who needs courage right now. Drop a comment below, what bold step are you taking this week? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a moment of faith that changes everything.